The morning Richard Thornfield pointed his finger at me across that boardroom and told me to apologize to his son or clean out my desk. I did something that surprised everyone in the room. I smiled. Not because I was afraid, not because I was going to obey, but because I had spent the past 3 weeks building a case that would eventually put Richard Thornfield, his son, and his daughter in federal custody, and I was not about to ruin it by losing my temper in front of 15 executives who were all watching to see what I would do next. Austin sat beside his father with that practiced smile. The kind you develop when you have been bailed out your entire life, and you genuinely cannot imagine a world where the consequences actually reach you. He looked relaxed, confident, like the outcome of this moment had already been decided. He was right that it had been decided. He just had no idea by whom. Before I tell you how this ends, I want you to understand something. I am not a dramatic person by nature. I am an engineer. I have spent my career working with specifications, material tolerances, structural requirements, and federal safety standards. I believe in evidence. I believe in documentation. I believe that if you do your job with precision and integrity long enough, those things will eventually protect you. What I did not fully appreciate, until the year I spent inside Meridian Defense Solutions, was that integrity requires active defense. It does not protect itself. My name is Nathan Bradley. I am 52 years old. I served 8 years in the United States Navy before I ever touched a corporate desk. And in that time, I learned one lesson that has never left me. The difference between acceptable and unacceptable is not always obvious from a distance, but it is always catastrophic up close. The Navy taught me that equipment failure was not a budget line item. It was a folded flag. It was a phone call that changed someone's family forever. You either built things to standard, or you accepted what followed when they were not. I carried that with me when I left the service and joined the manufacturing world. I started on the shop floor, learned every machine, understood every material. I studied federal defense contracting standards the way other people studied market reports. And after 18 years at Meridian Defense Solutions, I ran the engineering department with a team of 12 people who understood that their work had real consequences. We made components for military defense contracts, not furniture, not packaging. Components that would eventually be used in vehicles and equipment that soldiers depended on in conditions most people in our office building would never see. Every specification existed for a reason. Every test record had a purpose. And every shortcut had a consequence that I had spent my entire professional life trying to prevent. Then Richard Thornfield walked into a department meeting with his son, Austin, and introduced him as the future of the company. I want to be fair about my first impression of Austin, because it matters to the story. He was not unintelligent. He was 28. Wharton, MBA. Clearly sharp in a social way, he read a room quickly. Knew which names to use. Understood how to make people feel like they had just been paid a compliment when he was actually asking them for something. In another environment, those skills might have served him well, but he arrived at Meridian wearing a suit that cost more than 2 of my engineers made in a month, driving a car that sent its own message before he opened his mouth, and carrying a specific kind of confidence that belongs only to people who have never been fully held accountable for a serious mistake. Richard introduced him to the engineering department with the energy of a man unveiling something precious. This is Austin. He's here to modernize operations and bring fresh thinking to our cost structure. Austin smiled at the room. The room smiled back carefully. And Richard assigned him to shadow me. Nathan, show him the process. I agreed. What else could I do? Richard was the CEO and majority stakeholder. Austin was his son, and I genuinely believed, at that point, that I could guide the young man toward at least a basic understanding of why defense engineering was not an appropriate place for creative financial experimentation. That belief lasted less than a week. Austin's first proposal came on a Thursday afternoon. He walked into my office, set a printed spreadsheet on my desk, and explained with quiet enthusiasm that he had identified a way to cut material testing by 50% while maintaining current production output. Faster delivery, better margins. He had already run the numbers. I looked at the spreadsheet for a long moment. Then I looked up at him. "Austin," I said carefully, "we do not test materials because we enjoy the paperwork. We test them because every batch must meet federal safety standards before it ever gets installed in equipment that a soldier is going to rely on." He nodded in the way people nod when they have already decided you are being overly cautious. "Nate, I understand the traditional approach, but my father wants measurable progress. And this is a real opportunity." He said traditional approach, the way some people say outdated thinking, like experience itself, was something to be modernized. I told him the proposal was not viable. He wrote a note in his leather journal and left my office looking like a man who had simply encountered a temporary obstacle. That was the first warning sign I did not take seriously enough. 3 months later, Meridian landed the Blackwater defense contract. $200 million over 3 years. The largest contract in the company's 25-year history. Every senior executive celebrated. Richard sent an all-company email calling it a transformational moment. There were catered lunches, a company-wide announcement, photographs for the website. In the engineering department, we read the full contract specifications and scheduled a mandatory Saturday review session because the requirements were serious enough to deserve a weekend. We were manufacturing vehicle armor plating for military use. The contract called for 4,130 chromoly steel, a specific alloy with a specific strength-to-weight ratio that had been tested and approved for this application. It required documented heat treatment cycles, precise hardness testing, and ballistic evaluations on multiple samples from each production batch. These were not suggestions. They were the technical minimum required to produce armor that would function as armor. I read the final specifications twice before I signed the technical review. Then I briefed my team with one simple instruction. Nothing moves through this pipeline without meeting every requirement. No exceptions. 2 weeks after our briefing, Austin's first Blackwater cost analysis landed on my desk. On the surface, it looked impressive. Production expenses down 35%. Delivery timelines tightened. Profit margins sharply improved. It was exactly the kind of report that makes executives want to stand up and clap. I stayed in the office past 9 that night, going through it line by line. By the 3rd page, my hands had gone cold. Austin had replaced the required 4,130 chromoly steel with 7075 T6 aluminum alloy. He had removed the heat treatment cycles entirely. He had reduced ballistic testing from 3 samples per production batch to 1 sample per full production run. Not per batch, per run. The inspection documentation requirements had been cut in half. These were not optimizations. They were substitutions that violated the contract, violated federal procurement standards, and produced armor that would be measurably, demonstrably weaker than what the United States government had contracted and paid for. The armor would look correct on paper. It would ship on time. It would arrive with documentation that appeared complete. And if it failed in a field test, or worse, in actual use, there would be a chain of paperwork pointing straight to the engineering director who had signed off on it. Pointing straight to me. I did not sleep much that night. The following morning, I put Austin's report beside the original contract requirements and walked directly into Richard's office. "Richard, these are not improvements," I said, laying both documents on his desk. "They are material substitutions that violate the approved specifications. If Meridian submits armor plating that does not match what the Pentagon contracted, we are not looking at a performance penalty. We are looking at federal fraud charges." Richard looked at the documents briefly. Then he looked at me. Austin identified legitimate cost-saving opportunities. "Maybe you are being too conservative about change." I kept my voice even. "Aluminum alloy cannot replace chromoly steel in this application. That is not conservatism. That is physics." Something shifted in his expression. A small hardening around his eyes that told me we had just crossed a line I could not see from the other side. "Then maybe," Richard said quietly, "you need to decide whether you still fit the future of this company." I walked back to my office and closed the door behind me. I sat at my desk for a long time, looking at nothing in particular, trying to separate my personal feelings from the professional reality in front of me. What I understood, clearly and completely, was this. Richard Thornfield was not confused about what Austin was doing. He was protecting it. That changed everything. After that conversation, Austin dropped any remaining pretense that he was there to learn. He began attending my engineering briefings without invitation, sitting at the far end of the conference table, interrupting my technical explanations with polished phrases about cost, discipline, and modern operational thinking. When new engineers asked clarifying questions, Austin would redirect the discussion with language that made safety requirements sound like personal preferences. He was not just rewriting specifications. He was rewriting the culture of the department, one meeting at a time. Then the emails started. Austin began sending revised contract specifications directly to procurement contacts, and my name appeared in the copied line as though I had reviewed and approved every change. Some of the emails included phrases like, "as discussed with Nathan," or "per Nathan's engineering review." I had not discussed any of it. I had not reviewed any of it. My name was being used to give unauthorized changes the appearance of legitimate technical approval. During Pentagon site visits, when federal representatives asked specific questions about material tolerances or testing protocols, Austin would smile and gesture toward me with a look of collegial respect. "Nathan can walk you through the engineering details." Then, after the visitors left, Richard would pull me aside and quietly suggest I had created confusion. He was building a file. I just did not know it yet. Jordan Reed, my most experienced structural engineer, asked for a transfer to another department in the 4th month. He would not tell me why directly, but I had seen the way Austin's conversations left people looking smaller than when they started. And I had a guess. A week later, Amanda Foster submitted a similar request. Then, Charles Manning, who had been with me for 6 years, asked for a meeting and told me plainly that Austin had made several comments, implying that employees who aligned with me were not positioning themselves well for the company's future. 3 of my 12 engineers, gone in 3 weeks. I was being isolated, and I was too focused on the Blackwater evidence to fully understand how methodically it was happening. The night before the Pentagon compliance review, I stayed in the office past 9. My desk was covered with test documentation and specification cross-references, and I was on my 3rd cup of coffee when I heard voices from the main conference room down the hall. The door was open about 6 inches. I recognized Richard's voice first, then Austin's. "Dad, what if they ask technical questions I can't answer tomorrow?" There was a pause that felt longer than it probably was. "Then we explain," Richard said, in the calm tone of someone describing a plan they have already finalized, "that Nathan failed to provide adequate documentation. He has been resisting your improvements from the beginning." I stopped moving. My hand tightened around my phone. "So if this goes badly, we blame him?" Austin asked. "We do not blame him," Richard said. "We let the facts point to him." I stood in that hallway for a few seconds. Maybe 5. Maybe 10. Something cold and very clear moved through me. And when it passed, I was not afraid anymore. I understood now. This was never about modernization. It was never about cost efficiency. The changed specifications, the emails with my name on them, the gradually isolated team, the manufactured narrative of resistance and poor communication, it was all architecture. Richard had been building a frame for months, and I had been standing inside it without knowing the walls were there. I did not walk into that conference room. I did not raise my voice. I did not call anyone. I went back to my desk, opened my laptop, and I started building a different kind of structure. I had the original contract specifications, and I had Austin's altered versions. I had my written warnings to Richard and his dismissive replies. I had email chains where my name was used without my authorization. I had meeting notes with dates and attendee lists. I had revision histories from the contract management system showing exactly when each file was changed and from which user account. I pulled every version of every Blackwater document from our archived engineering server. I created a clean comparison file, item by item, change by change, showing what the contract required, what Austin submitted, and the engineering consequence of each substitution. 23 items, 23 unauthorized changes, 23 reasons a federal compliance review would find the submitted armor plating materially deficient. I saved duplicates to an encrypted external drive that I carried out of the building that night and stored in my car. Then I opened my phone and played back the audio I had recorded while standing in that hallway. It was clear. Voices distinct. The plan stated plainly, and without ambiguity, by a CEO and his son the night before a federal compliance review. I did not know yet how I was going to use it. I only knew I was not going to let it disappear. 3 days later, my cell phone rang from a number I did not recognize. I almost did not answer. Nate. It was Eric Daniels. From IT Security. His voice was quieter than usual. Don't talk about this at the office. Meet me at Murphy's Diner on Route 9. 8 o'clock tonight. Come alone. Eric was the kind of person who made the systems work quietly and never needed recognition for it. He was not someone who manufactured urgency. So I drove to Murphy's. He was already in the back booth when I arrived. His laptop bag was tucked against his leg, and he spent a moment looking at the door before he met my eyes. "You have a bigger problem than you realize," he said, and turned the screen toward me. Richard had been monitoring my company email, my office phone calls, and every document I accessed or modified for the past 2 months. The log files showed access timestamps, keyword flags, even screenshots of certain emails. Richard had been reading my drafts before I sent them. I stared at the screen and thought about every conversation I had believed was private. Then Eric clicked into a second folder. He wasn't doing this alone, Eric said. Madison Thornfield, Richard's daughter. Her official title at Meridian was Director of Corporate Communications. Her actual function, apparently, was something else entirely. Eric showed me a server directory organized by date, department, and employee name. Inside were audio recordings, not from boardrooms or formal meeting spaces, where recording could at least be explained as policy. From private offices, personal phone calls, hallway conversations, one-on-one discussions between employees who believed they were speaking in confidence. My name appeared in the directory dozens of times, but Madison had not limited her collection to my conversations. The directory was extensive enough to suggest she had been building it for years. I recognized other names, people who had left the company under unclear circumstances, people who had once asked inconvenient questions and then gone quiet. Then Eric opened a subfolder labeled Patricia Caldwell. Patricia was Meridian's largest outside investor. She was in her 60s, consistently composed, never spoke more in a board meeting than the situation required. Richard treated her with the particular kind of public deference that usually conceals something less courteous behind the scenes. Inside her folder were notes on her personal financial records, private communications with other investors, and what appeared to be excerpts from conversations she believed were confidential. I looked at Eric. "You're not the first person he's built a file on," Eric said. He told me about Thomas Anderson, quality control supervisor, who had raised concerns about a supplier substitution 4 years earlier, before Thomas could take his concerns anywhere useful. Richard had discovered a personal financial issue in Thomas's background and threatened to surface it with federal clearance authorities. Thomas resigned within a month. He told me about Lisa Martinez, procurement manager, who had made the mistake of telling a colleague, in what she believed was a private conversation, that Austin was clearly unqualified for his role. Madison's recording became the instrument Richard used to make Lisa's position untenable. She was gone within 6 weeks. There were 2 other names Eric mentioned. I recognized both of them. Good engineers who had simply stopped working at Meridian one day without much explanation. The pattern was consistent. Find the threat. Collect information. Apply pressure at the exact point where a person was most vulnerable. And if necessary, Use the accumulated files to ensure the person would have trouble finding comparable work afterward. He does not just fire people, Eric said. He makes sure they cannot work in defense contracting again. I sat with that for a moment. Why are you showing me all of this? I asked. Eric looked down at his coffee cup for a moment, then back up. Because this time he picked the wrong person to frame, and because you might still have time to stop him. Then he told me about Patricia Caldwell. What I knew about Patricia was investor-level knowledge. She held a significant stake in Meridian. She asked precise questions at board meetings, and she had a way of waiting while other people talked themselves into corners. What I did not know was that before she became an investor in defense companies, she had spent 15 years working in Pentagon procurement oversight. She has been asking questions for months. Eric said, she noticed the performance numbers were not adding up. Lower production costs, faster delivery, improved margins, but on contracts that historically required extensive testing and verification. Patricia did not know about the surveillance files. She did not know the depth of Richard's operation, but she had been watching the financial indicators long enough to understand that the improvements Austin was claiming were not mathematically possible through legitimate process changes. She needs proof, Eric said. You have the engineering evidence. I have the logs. Together. That might be enough. 3 days later, I sat across from Patricia Caldwell in a quiet coffee shop 12 miles from the office. With a folder of documents between us, I walked her through everything. The original Blackwater specifications, Austin's revised versions, the 23 unauthorized changes, my written warnings to Richard, the email chains with my name falsely copied, the recording from the night before the compliance review, the one where Richard explained to his son that they would let the facts point to me. Patricia listened without interrupting. She turned pages methodically, pausing on specific items, rereading certain sections. When she finally set the folder down and looked at me, her voice was quiet and very precise. Nathan, this is not cost optimization. This is federal fraud. She opened her own folder. I have been tracking Meridian's financial reports against known performance benchmarks for 6 months. She said, Austin's department claims to have saved $2.3 million across 8 Pentagon contracts in 4 months. That is not operationally possible without changing materials, skipping tests, or falsifying inspection records. She pointed to a highlighted section. Real process improvements take time. They require validation cycles, documentation updates, and incremental testing. You cannot compress the timeline of defense engineering without cutting something that was put there to protect someone. The Blackwater contract was not an isolated incident. It was where the pattern became too large to hide. Patricia's plan was built on patience. She would use her Pentagon contacts to request an unannounced compliance audit, a standard federal tool for investigating contract irregularities, triggered without advance notice to the contractor. Eric would preserve the full surveillance directory before Madison had time to delete it. I would prepare the complete technical package specifications, alteration records, audit trail, email chain, and the audio recording. The board meeting was 2 weeks away. Richard intended to formally announce Austin's promotion to engineering director at that meeting. Patricia looked at me across the table. Let him do it, she said. Let him stand in front of the board and make that announcement. Let him lie to everyone in the room at the same moment. Federal investigators are reviewing what he sent to the Pentagon. I drove home that night feeling something I had not felt in months. Not comfort. Exactly. Not relief. Something closer to solid ground. I had walked into this meeting hoping for an ally. I had left it with a plan. The audit came earlier than we expected. Monday afternoon. Richard called me to his office. When I walked in, Austin was standing beside Richard's desk wearing an expression he probably practiced in mirrors. There was a third person in the room, a man in a dark suit, with a thin leather folder and a Pentagon identification badge clipped to his jacket. Nathan, Richard said warmly. This is Inspector Williams from Pentagon Procurement Oversight. He has some questions about the Blackwater specifications. Inspector Williams placed several documents on Richard's desk. He looked at me directly. Mr. Bradley, we have received reports of irregularities in your contract submissions. These specifications do not match the original procurement requirements. Can you explain why they were approved under your name? Austin tilted his head with the expression of someone deeply concerned about a valued colleague. The trap had arrived a week early, but I had been ready for it. I looked at the documents. I looked at Inspector Williams. I did not approve these specifications. I said, the changes were made without my authorization, and they violate both federal contract requirements and basic engineering safety standards. Austin stepped forward immediately. Nathan, we discussed these optimizations in multiple engineering reviews. Everyone present can confirm that. No, I said. You presented them. I rejected them. In writing, on 3 separate occasions. Richard shifted his posture. When he spoke, his voice was carrying the weight of a man who had navigated difficult rooms before. Inspector, Nathan has struggled to adapt to our modernization efforts. This may be a communication issue more than a compliance issue. I turned to Inspector Williams. Then I am requesting a formal review of every engineering document, email record, and revision history connected to this contract. And I am requesting that review begin today. The room was quiet for a moment. Richard had expected this meeting to end with my apology. He had expected the inspector to see a resistant employee being slowly, professionally managed out of a company moving forward without him. He had expected Austin to stand beside him, looking like the calm voice of modern thinking. Inspector Williams closed his folder. Given the nature of the allegation, he said, Pentagon Procurement Oversight will initiate a formal compliance review immediately. The boardroom meeting came 4 days later. Rain was hitting the windows in irregular bursts, and the room had the particular quality of silence that happens when everyone in it is waiting for something to happen, but no one is sure exactly what form it will take. Richard stood at the head of the table with the composure of a man who had survived difficult situations before and expected to survive this one. 15 board members watched him. Federal investigators were conducting interviews in a conference room 2 floors below. Richard opened with a story. He described Austin's arrival at Meridian as a necessary evolution. He praised the cost improvements. He framed the Pentagon review as a routine process triggered by a disgruntled employee who had failed to adapt. He was articulate, measured. He had clearly rehearsed this version of events more than once. Then he looked at me and said the words he had been building toward for months. Before we formalize Austin's appointment as engineering director, we need to address Nathan Bradley's pattern of obstruction. I stood up. I connected my tablet to the boardroom display before Richard could object. I opened the file I had spent weeks preparing. The first slide showed the original Blackwater specification beside Austin's revised version. The substitutions were visible immediately. Chromoly steel replaced by aluminum alloy. Heat treatment cycles gone. Ballistic testing reduced to a fraction of the requirement. I moved through the slides without rushing. 23 contract items. 23 unauthorized changes. 23 written warnings from me that had been dismissed, overridden, or simply never acknowledged. These modifications were submitted under my name. I said, I did not approve them. I warned Richard and Austin in writing, on multiple occasions, that these changes violated federal contract requirements and could endanger the soldiers. This equipment was designed to protect. Austin's chair scraped the floor as he stood. That is misleading, he said. Those were preliminary studies. Nathan was involved in every stage of the analysis. Richard raised one hand in a practiced gesture of calm. This is exactly the kind of confusion I was describing. I opened the audio file. The recording was clear. No background noise. 2 voices. Both unmistakable. Austin's voice first, asking what to do if the inspector asked questions he could not answer. Then Richard's voice, calm and deliberate. We explained that Nathan failed to provide adequate documentation. He has been resisting your improvements from the beginning. Then Austin, so, if this goes badly, We blame him. Then, Richard, we do not blame him. We let the facts point to him. The recording ran for 11 seconds after that. Nobody in the room moved. I looked at the board members around the table. I saw the moment when calculations shifted to recognition, when people who had chosen not to see something could no longer maintain that choice. The boardroom door opened. Inspector Williams walked in with 2 federal agents behind him. He looked at Richard. "Mr. Thornfield," he said, "our preliminary review has confirmed unauthorized specification changes, falsified approval records, and evidence of a coordinated effort to mislead Pentagon procurement authorities." Austin's face lost its color in a way that happened too fast to be controlled. Richard stood slowly. "Inspector, I believe we can clarify." "No," Williams said. "This is a federal matter." The agents moved forward. For the first time in the 4 years I had watched Richard Thornfield run this company, he had no one left to threaten. Richard Thornfield, Austin Thornfield, and Madison Thornfield, you are under arrest for conspiracy to defraud the United States government. The federal investigation took 3 months to complete. By the end, prosecutors had documented not one fraudulent contract, but a pattern falsified approval records, manipulated cost reports, unauthorized material substitutions across 8 Pentagon contracts, and a company-wide surveillance operation used to silence anyone who might have interfered. Richard had believed the structure he built was invisible. It was not invisible. It was simply hidden in places no one had looked until Eric Daniels and I spent 3 weeks looking. Richard pleaded guilty to federal fraud charges and received 4 years in federal prison, along with $7.5 million in fines and restitution to the government. Austin lost his position, his professional reputation, and any realistic future in government contracting. Several affected military units filed civil claims against former Meridian leadership. The BMW was repossessed during asset proceedings, which I learned about from a paralegal's offhand comment and did not particularly enjoy noting as much as I did. Madison cooperated with investigators after it became clear her father could no longer protect her from the consequences of what her recordings contained. She lost her security clearance and accepted a probationary agreement. The Thornfield name, which had moved through Meridian's halls for 4 years, like it carried its own kind of gravity, became something people at the company spoke about in the past tense, carefully, without nostalgia. 3 months after the arrests, I was sitting in what used to be Richard Thornfield's office, looking at a photograph on the wall that my engineering team had framed for me on my first week as Senior Vice President of Engineering. There was nothing triumphant about how I felt sitting there. I want to be clear about that, because I think revenge stories sometimes end with the wrong emotion. I did not feel victorious. I felt tired in a way that had started to lift. I felt something that had been compressed in my chest for months beginning, slowly, to return to its correct shape. I had not wanted that office. I had wanted to do my job correctly and go home at a reasonable hour. But Meridian had just survived something that could have ended the company, ended careers. And if Austin's armor specifications had gone further down the supply chain, potentially ended lives. The board needed someone to lead the engineering department who understood that none of this could ever be treated as a cost variable. I started rebuilding the team. 16 engineers, up from 9. Every hire made on the basis of skill, judgment, and the demonstrated ability to say clearly when something was wrong. No famous last names. No executive relatives learning the industry on live defense contracts. We renegotiated the Blackwater contract from the ground up. Correct steel. Restored heat treatment documentation. Expanded ballistic testing. Independent quality audits that existed outside the management hierarchy. Patricia Caldwell took the chair of the board and made one policy change. Her first official act, engineering, had final authority over safety specifications. Not finance. Not executive leadership. Engineering. Eric Daniels became Chief Information Officer. His first action was dismantling Madison's surveillance network and replacing it with transparent security policies that were legal, documented, and applied uniformly. people stopped checking over their shoulders in the hallways. Engineers who had transferred away started sending emails asking whether positions were available. A few of them came back. Thomas Anderson. The quality control supervisor Richard had driven out years earlier. Sent me a message when the news broke. It was 3 sentences. The last one said I should have fought harder. I wrote back and told him the truth that fighting harder might have only gotten him destroyed faster. And that the system was designed to make that the logical outcome. Richard had not been stupid about how he built his operation. He had been systematic. He had understood that people in professional environments are vulnerable to the same fears: losing their income, losing their reputation, losing access to the kind of work they had trained their entire lives to do. He had identified those pressure points methodically and applied force exactly where it would produce silence. What he had not accounted for was the combination of someone with nothing left to lose, someone with technical expertise specific enough to be verifiable, and someone with access to the architecture of his own surveillance network. He had built the system that eventually provided the evidence to dismantle him. I have been asked whether I regret how long I waited, whether I should have gone to federal authorities earlier, before Richard had time to build his frame. The honest answer is more complicated than yes or no. I stayed patient partly because I did not yet understand the full scope of what I was dealing with. I thought I was managing a nepotism problem. I thought if I documented my objections clearly enough, if I stayed professional and kept my warnings on record, the situation would resolve itself through normal institutional channels. I did not know I was standing inside a machine designed specifically to absorb that kind of response and neutralize it. What I learned, and what I want to say plainly, because I think it is the most practically useful thing I can offer, is this: documentation is not enough if you keep it to yourself. The emails I saved were important. The recording was important. The comparison file with 23 unauthorized contract changes was important. But none of it would have moved until I handed it to someone who had the standing and the relationships to activate a federal response. Patricia Caldwell was that person. I did not find her. Eric brought her to me. And Eric came to me because he was watching someone do something dangerous to the institution he had spent his career inside. And he decided that watching was no longer enough. Integrity does not protect itself. That is the part I had to learn the hard way. The morning after Richard's sentencing, I drove to the office the same way I had driven to the office for 18 years. Same route, same parking spot, same coffee from the machine in the 3rd floor break room that has never quite made coffee correctly, but has also never been replaced. I sat at my desk and read through the latest batch of material compliance reports from the engineering team. Thorough, documented. Every item cross-referenced against contract requirements. A junior engineer knocked on my open door. She was 26. 2 years with the company. And she had the particular expression of someone who already knew the answer to her own question but wanted to make sure she was reading the situation correctly. She held up a testing report. I found a batch variance in the latest hardness sample. She said, "It's within tolerance. But it's close. I wanted to flag it before anything moved forward." I looked at the report. She was right. It was close. Hold the batch. I said, "Run the full protocol. Document everything." She nodded once, thanked me, and left. I sat with my coffee for a moment. That was it. That was the whole thing. Really. Not the arrests. Not the boardroom recording. Not the federal investigation that stretched across 3 months and produced headlines neither Richard nor Austin had ever imagined about themselves. The whole point of all of it was that one conversation: a junior engineer, a batch variance, and a department where nobody had to wonder whether raising a concern was career-ending. I think about the men and women in the field who depend on the things we build. I think about them the way I learned to think about equipment in the Navy, not abstractly, not as a liability consideration, but as the specific human weight of the decision being made right now, at this desk, with this report in my hands. Richard built a company where that weight was invisible. My job was to make it visible again. I am still here, still signing off on equipment that meets the standard, still telling anyone who will listen that the most dangerous thing in a defense engineering department is not a miscalculation or a machine failure. It is a culture where people are afraid to say when something is wrong. If this story stayed with you, subscribe and leave a comment below. Would you have stayed patient and gathered evidence? Or would you have confronted Richard the moment you understood what he was doing? And if you have ever worked somewhere that protected the wrong person at the expense of the right one, I would really like to hear your story.